The shift from private authority to public memory at Vizcaya did not require a rupture. No gates were broken. No banners were lowered. The change occurred through administration, through policy, through caretaking. The estate continued to be cleaned, repaired, catalogued. The difference lay in purpose. What had once been a working system, one that consumed resources, in order to project dominance, was gradually redefined as something to be stabilized rather than exercised when Vizcaya ceased to function as a private organism. Its internal logic was inverted. Rooms designed for control became rooms designed for circulation. Pathways once managed to enforce hierarchy were open to accommodate flow. The estate's routine staff rotations, procurement schedules, seasonal adjustments were preserved only in outline, their original intensity replaced by institutional procedure. The structure remained legible, but its authority no longer acted. This transition altered how time moved through the property. Under private ownership, time at Vizcaya was directive. It followed the rhythms of command. Arrivals planned to impress. Dinners timed to demonstrate excess. Vistas maintained to reinforce dominance. Each hour served a purpose tied to influence. In its public form, time became neutral. Days are now shaped by visiting hours, maintenance windows, conservation cycles. The estate no longer anticipates power. It accommodates presence. The gardens illustrate this transformation with particular clarity. They were engineered to appear inevitable, as if they had emerged naturally from the terrain. In reality, they required constant intervention, soil imported, plants replaced, drainage engineered against a climate that resisted symmetry. Under private control, this labor was invisible by design. The illusion of permanence depended on uninterrupted correction. Today, that correction continues, but its intention has changed. The gardens are preserved not to assert mastery over nature, but to prevent visible failure. Survival has replaced ambition. This recalibration extends to the people who move through Vizcaya now. Visitors arrive without obligation. They are not being measured, evaluated, or absorbed into a hierarchy. Their presence does not reinforce the estate's authority. It consumes it. Each guided path, each explanatory placard, converts command into context. The estate explains itself rather than asserting itself. What was once self-evident power now requires interpretation. The architecture bears this quietly. The walls still perform their visual work. The ceiling still frames space with calculated weight. But these elements no longer operate within a closed system. They exist in isolation, detached from the network of labor, capital, and intent that once animated them. The house no longer commands its surroundings. It is contained by them. This containment was not inevitable. It emerged from a broader shift in how wealth interacts with permanence. Vizcaya was built at a moment when private capital believed it could substitute for history. The estate did not seek to inherit legacy. It sought to manufacture it. That project required continuity of fortune, of relevance, of control. When those conditions weakened, the structure did not collapse. It adapted. Adaptation, however, carries a cost. To survive, Vizcaya relinquished exclusivity. To be maintained, it surrendered authority. What remains is not diminished in appearance, but altered in function. The estate still stands, but it no longer decides. Its survival depends on systems external to itself: public funding, institutional oversight, cultural consensus. Power has been replaced by permission. This is the condition in which Vizcaya now exists, intact, admired, carefully managed, and fundamentally resolved. Not ruined, but concluded. The estate persists, yet its original purpose has been quietly set aside, preserved only as evidence of a moment when wealth attempted to harden itself into permanence. Once Vizcaya entered this state of managed endurance, its relationship to labor changed irrevocably. The estate was originally sustained by a workforce organized around discretion and obedience. Gardeners, attendants, artisans, and domestic staff operated within a closed hierarchy that allowed no ambiguity of purpose. Their work was continuous, corrective, and largely unseen. Labor existed to erase evidence of effort. The success of the system depended on this erasure dot in its preserved form. Labor becomes visible by necessity. Conservation records are maintained. Restoration phases are announced. The estate's survival now requires explanation, justification, and compliance with standards that did not exist when it was built. What was once a private command economy becomes a regulated process. Authority no longer flows downward. It is negotiated laterally between institutions, budgets, and public expectation. This shift reframes the estate's material integrity. Objects once chosen to signal permanence, stone imported at high cost, finishes designed to weather slowly, decorative elements meant to suggest centuries are now treated as vulnerable. Their value lies not in what they assert, but in what they represent. Preservation prioritizes authenticity over dominance. The goal is not to extend power, but to arrest loss. Each intervention is measured against the risk of altering the historical record. In this environment, Vizcaya's original ambition becomes legible in a way it never was while operational. The estate can now be studied rather than obeyed. Its architectural decisions reveal the anxieties they were meant to suppress, the fear of climate, of impermanence, of cultural illegitimacy. The very scale of the project, its insistence on imported order, exposes the uncertainty that necessitated it. Preservation, by stabilizing the structure, removes the urgency that once justified its success. The estate's surroundings further emphasize this shift. The landscape beyond its walls has continued to transform, absorbing the forces Vizcaya was built to resist. Development, environmental change, and shifting patterns of wealth have redefined the region. Vizcaya remains fixed within this motion, increasingly distinct not as a seat of influence, but as a reference point. It does not shape its environment. It is contextualized by it. What endures, then, is not the system Vizcaya was designed to sustain, but the evidence of that system's limits. The estate demonstrates how private power can construct permanence, but also how that permanence depends on conditions that cannot be secured indefinitely. Wealth may build structures, but it cannot guarantee their relevance. When the logic that animates an institution dissolves, survival becomes a matter of reinterpretation. Vizcaya's current state is neither failure nor triumph. It is an outcome. The estate has exchanged authority for continuity, command for caretaking. In doing so, it reveals a quieter truth about endurance. Permanence is not achieved by resisting change, but by submitting to it selectively. The estate stands not because it overcame time, but because it allowed itself to be redefined by a dot in this form. Vizcaya no longer asserts a claim on the future. It holds a position within memory. Its value lies in what it records rather than what it controls. The stone remains, the gardens persist, the rooms are intact, but the system that once animated them has been absorbed into history. What survives is a structure that has outlived its purpose and learned, through preservation, how to remain without ruling. Vizcaya now exists in a state of formal completion. Its walls remain aligned to the water. Its interiors retain their proportion and weight. The gardens still hold their geometry against the surrounding growth. Nothing appears unfinished. Yet the estate no longer operates as it once did. What survives is a structure without internal command, a place whose visible order no longer corresponds to an active system of power. This distinction defines its present condition. Vizcaya was conceived as a functioning estate, not a display. Its architecture, circulation, and sightlines were designed to regulate movement, labor, and perception simultaneously. Space was not neutral. It was directive. Rooms were arranged to stage authority. Gardens were engineered to appear effortless while concealing the scale of intervention required to sustain them. The estate's coherence depended on continuous decision-making exercised from a single center. That center is gone. What remains is an intact framework that no longer generates its own purpose. The house is maintained, but it does not direct. The grounds are preserved, but they no longer instruct behavior. Vizcaya's systems, once integrated and hierarchical, now exist as parallel functions managed independently. Conservation replaces command. Access replaces control. This change alters how the estate is encountered. Movement through Vizcaya is no longer restricted by rank or invitation. Paths once designed to enforce sequence are now routes of accommodation. The estate absorbs visitors rather than filtering them. Its spaces formerly calibrated to produce impression and deference now serve orientation and explanation. Authority has been replaced by legibility. The routines that sustain Vizcaya reflect this shift. Under private operation, maintenance was continuous and anticipatory. Surfaces were corrected before deterioration could be observed. Landscapes were reshaped to maintain the illusion of inevitability. These routines were not merely functional. They were ideological. They existed to support the claim that permanence had been achieved. In the present, maintenance is reactive and documented. Intervention is measured against preservation standards rather than ambition. The goal is stability, not dominance. Time itself behaves differently within the estate. When Vizcaya functioned as a private system, time was organized around display and control arrivals, gatherings, seasonal adjustments made to reinforce presence. Each moment served a purpose aligned with authority. Today, time passes without assertion. Hours are structured by operational necessity rather than social command. The estate no longer projects forward. It endures. This endurance does not diminish Vizcaya's physical presence. If anything, it clarifies it. The materials, proportions, and imported references remain legible. But they now operate without consequence. Stone meant to suggest longevity no longer guarantees influence. Ornament intended to anchor status now exists without hierarchy to sustain it. The estate's visual language persists. Detached from the power, it was designed to communicate. In this state, Vizcaya becomes something different from what it was built to be. It is not ruined. It has not failed structurally. Instead, it has been reclassified. The estate has crossed from private instrument to public artifact. Its survival depends not on wealth exercising control, but on institutions agreeing to preserve form without function. What was once an active system has been stabilized into evidence. This transformation establishes the central tension that defines Vizcaya in the present, the coexistence of intact appearance and absent purpose. The estate stands complete, yet incomplete in meaning. Its systems no longer converge. Its authority no longer operates. What remains is a carefully sustained shell whose endurance depends on acknowledging that the conditions which once animated it have quietly withdrawn. With its reclassification came a fundamental shift in how Vizcaya relates to labor, material, and authority. The estate no longer commands work in order to conceal it. Instead, work is made explicit, scheduled, and recorded. Conservation reports replace private directives. Budgets define possibility. The estate's survival is now contingent on transparency rather than discretion. What was once absorbed into the illusion of permanence must now be accounted for. This visibility reshapes the meaning of the estate's materials. Stone, wood, iron, and plaster were selected to imply durability and lineage, yet they now require constant evaluation. Their value lies less in what they signify than in what they can still retain. Preservation treats these elements as finite, vulnerable, and subject to loss. The effort is not to extend their authority, but to slow their decline without altering their historical trace. In this context, Vizcaya's original ambition becomes legible in unintended ways. The estate reveals the extent to which permanence was constructed rather than inherited. Its imported forms and controlled vistas expose the insecurity they were meant to overcome. By fixing the estate in time, preservation allows these tensions to surface. The system no longer corrects for doubt. It displays it. The relationship between Vizcaya and its surroundings further underscores this condition. The estate once attempted to impose coherence on a landscape resistant to order. That resistance has not ceased. Environmental pressure, urban development, and shifting patterns of use continue to reshape the area beyond its boundaries. Vizcaya does not respond. It remains fixed, increasingly defined by contrast rather than control. The estate has become referential rather than directive. Authority within Vizcaya now operates externally. Decisions are shaped by regulatory frameworks, cultural expectations, and institutional stewardship. No single will defines the estate's direction. Instead, consensus governs preservation. This diffused authority ensures continuity, but it also limits transformation. Vizcaya persists by accepting constraint, trading autonomy for survival. What emerges is a structure that endures without asserting relevance. Vizcaya no longer claims the future. It occupies a stabilized present, held in place by agreement rather than power. Its spaces remain intact, its geometry unbroken, yet its purpose has been fundamentally altered. The estate stands not as a living system, but as a record of one maintained, interpreted, and bounded by the recognition that what once animated it cannot be restored. In this condition, Vizcaya achieves a different form of permanence. Not the permanence it sought, but one defined by limits. Its survival depends on restraint, on the refusal to reactivate its original logic. The estate remains because it has been allowed to stop functioning. What endures is not authority, but structure preserved in full view of the absence it now contains. Vizcaya did not emerge from excess alone. It arose from uncertainty. At the moment of its conception, American wealth had reached a scale that exceeded its own cultural grounding. Capital was abundant, mobile, and newly confident. Yet it lacked the historical scaffolding that had long legitimized power elsewhere. In regions where lineage was thin and memory shallow, authority required construction. Vizcaya was one such construction. South Florida offered no inherited hierarchy. Its social order was provisional, shaped by climate, speculation, and rapid turnover. Land changed hands quickly. Fortunes appeared without precedent. There were no ancestral houses to anchor influence, no centuries-old estates to absorb new power into old form. In this environment, wealth existed without context. Vizcaya was built to supply that context. The estate addressed a specific cultural problem: how to translate economic power into social authority in a place where neither tradition nor restraint imposed limits. Vizcaya answered by importing legitimacy wholesale. Its architecture referenced European continuity. Its gardens imposed discipline on an unruly landscape. Its materials suggested endurance where none had yet been proven. The estate did not merely display taste. It asserted belonging within a longer narrative of power. This assertion mattered because American elites at the turn of the 20th century were acutely aware of their own fragility. Fortunes were large but recent. Status could be purchased, but recognition was less certain. In older centers of power, legitimacy accrued slowly through inheritance and repetition. In America's expanding frontier regions, legitimacy had to be staged. Vizcaya was such a stage, designed to compress centuries of authority into a single, visible system. The estate's scale was deliberate. It exceeded functional need. Rooms were not sized for comfort alone, but for comparison. Corridors framed movement as procession. Vistas extended sightlines to suggest command over distance. Every element reinforced the same message: permanence had arrived. Vizcaya was not a residence adapting to its environment. It was an environment reordered to validate residence. This reordering required discipline. The climate resisted symmetry. The terrain resisted control. Sustaining the estate demanded continuous intervention engineering, labor, and expense to maintain the illusion of inevitability. That effort was essential. Without it, the estate would have appeared theatrical rather than authoritative. Vizcaya's success depended on the seamless alignment of appearance and power. Culturally, the estate functioned as reassurance. It signaled that American wealth could do more than accumulate. It could civilize itself. Vizcaya demonstrated that money, properly applied, could produce taste, continuity, and restraint. This was not simply personal ambition. It was a broader argument about the legitimacy of a new elite class, seeking parity with older systems of power. In a region defined by flux, Vizcaya offered stillness. In a culture defined by acceleration, it imposed duration. Its existence suggested that authority need not be inherited if it could be convincingly assembled. The estate's purpose was not to belong to Florida as it was, but to redefine what belonging meant there. Vizcaya had to exist because the system around it lacked the structures that normally stabilize power. It filled an absence. It answered a cultural need that could not be met through commerce alone. The estate stood as proof that wealth could manufacture its own legitimacy, provided it was given form, discipline, and visible permanence. The necessity of Vizcaya also lay in its timing. It emerged at a point when American elites were no longer content to be merely wealthy. Industrial expansion had produced fortunes at a pace that outstripped cultural assimilation. Wealth had become visible everywhere, but authority remained unevenly distributed. In established cities, institutions absorbed and moderated power. In peripheral regions like South Florida, there were no such buffers. Influence had to announce itself or risk dilution. Vizcaya answered this by performing stability in a landscape defined by impermanence. Its presence slowed the surrounding tempo. The estate did not adapt to regional norms. It imposed an alternative order. This imposition was itself a declaration. It signaled that power could choose its setting and reshape it accordingly. In doing so, Vizcaya positioned itself not as a response to Florida, but as a corrective to it. Taste played a critical role in this process. Taste, unlike wealth, cannot be asserted directly. It must be demonstrated through restraint, reference, and coherence. Vizcaya's design avoided novelty. It relied on established forms, familiar hierarchies of space, and recognizable symbols of cultivation. This conservatism was strategic. It allowed the estate to claim continuity without requiring lineage. By aligning itself with older visual languages of authority, Vizcaya bypassed questions of origin. The estate also functioned as a filter. Entry was selective, access was controlled. Interaction occurred within carefully defined spaces. This regulation transformed the estate into a social instrument, one capable of distinguishing inclusion from exclusion. Authority was not merely displayed. It was enacted through routine. The estate's daily operations reinforced hierarchy, reinforcing the idea that power here was orderly, deliberate, and deserved. This mattered beyond the boundaries of the property. Vizcaya operated as a signal to other centers of influence. It announced that American wealth could sustain complexity, not just scale. It suggested that capital had matured enough to reproduce the forms that once validated older elites. In this sense, the estate was less about regional dominance than national self-assurance. It demonstrated that legitimacy could be engineered, provided sufficient resources and discipline were applied. The cultural work Vizcaya performed was therefore subtle but extensive. It normalized the presence of concentrated power in a place that had not yet developed its own hierarchies. It made inequality appear structured rather than arbitrary. By embedding wealth within architecture, landscape, and ritual, the estate rendered dominance legible and, by extension, acceptable. Yet this necessity also exposed a limitation. Vizcaya depended entirely on sustained intention. Its authority was not inherited through time, but maintained through effort. The estate could assert permanence only as long as the system supporting it remained intact. The very need for such an assertion revealed the fragility beneath it. Vizcaya had to exist because the culture that produced it could not rely on history to confer legitimacy. It required visible proof. The estate supplied that proof through form, discipline, and scale. It resolved an anxiety specific to its moment, answering uncertainty with structure. In doing so, it established itself as a necessary artifact of American power, one whose existence clarified both the ambition and the limits of manufactured authority. Vizcaya began as a proposition rather than a place. Before stone was set or land reshaped, it existed as an answer to a problem: how authority might be generated where none had accumulated naturally. There was no inherited framework to occupy, no existing hierarchy to enter. Authority would have to be assembled deliberately, through design, coordination, and sustained will. Vizcaya was conceived as that assembly. The project did not aim to reflect its surroundings. It aimed to override them. South Florida offered abundance, but little structure space without order, growth without memory. Vizcaya countered this condition by introducing a closed system calibrated to discipline its environment. The estate was planned as a total arrangement in which architecture, landscape, labor, and movement operated toward a single end. Control was not symbolic. It was operational. This control began with orientation. The estate's alignment to water, sky, and terrain was not aesthetic alone. It established dominance over approach and visibility. Arrival was choreographed. Views were framed to suggest command over distance. The house did not merely sit within the landscape. It reorganized perception of it. Space was converted into hierarchy through sequencing and scale. Architecture carried this logic inward. Rooms were not neutral containers but instruments. Their proportions regulated behavior. Circulation enforced order. Private and public zones were separated not only by walls but by implied authority. Movement through the house reflected a gradient of access, reinforcing the idea that power was spatially distributed and deliberately guarded. Nothing about the interior was accidental. Labor formed the invisible spine of the system. Vizcaya required constant human correction to maintain its appearance of inevitability. Gardens were shaped against climate. Surfaces were preserved against decay. Staff routines ensured continuity without visibility. The success of the estate depended on the disappearance of effort. Authority functioned best when it appeared effortless, when control masked itself as permanence. Materials reinforced this ideology. Stone, imported and heavy, suggested endurance. Ornament referenced established traditions rather than innovation. The estate avoided novelty in favor of recognition. Its visual language was conservative by design, borrowing legitimacy from older systems of power. By aligning itself with familiar forms of authority, Vizcaya sought to bypass questions of origin. It did not need to explain itself if it resembled what had always ruled. What emerged was an architectural argument. Vizcaya asserted that wealth, if sufficiently organized, could generate its own legitimacy. The estate was not a backdrop for power. It was a machine for producing it. Every element contributed to a coherent claim. That authority could be constructed through discipline, scale, and continuity, even in the absence of history. This construction required insulation. Vizcaya was designed to operate as a closed circuit, protected from the volatility of its surroundings. Its routines were internal, its standards self-imposed. The estate absorbed resources without reflecting external conditions. In doing so, it attempted to stabilize power by isolating it from fluctuation. Control was maintained by reducing dependency on anything beyond the system itself. The result was an environment that appeared inevitable precisely because it was artificial. Vizcaya did not grow into authority, it imposed it. The estate's coherence derived from sustained intention, not inheritance. This distinction defined both its strength and its vulnerability. Authority here was real, but it was maintained only as long as the system remained intact. Vizcaya was built to demonstrate that nothing need precede power if power could be convincingly arranged. It was an act of control executed through architecture, labor, and ritual, designed to make authority appear native where it had been introduced. The estate's origins lie not in personal ambition, but in a broader effort to manufacture legitimacy through form. Once established, this constructed authority had to be rehearsed continuously. Vizcaya did not rely on a single assertion of power. It depended on repetition. Daily routines reinforced hierarchy through consistency. Access was managed not by force but by familiarity with boundaries. The estate trained those within it, staff and guest alike, to accept its internal logic as natural. Authority persisted because it was enacted quietly, without interruption. The landscape functioned as a parallel system of control. Gardens were not decorative margins but extensions of governance. Their geometry resisted the surrounding environment, signaling that disorder would be corrected before it became visible. Paths directed movement. Sightlines disciplined attention. Even leisure was structured, contained within views that reaffirmed mastery over space. Nature, as presented here, was permitted only insofar as it obeyed design. This orchestration extended beyond the physical. Vizcaya operated as a cultural signal, communicating its authority outward through reputation and reference. Its existence implied discernment, resources, and command over complexity. The estate did not need to explain its rules. Its coherence implied them. Those who entered encountered a system already complete, already confident in its own legitimacy. Crucially, this authority was not adaptable. Vizcaya's power derived from precision, not flexibility. Its routines depended on continuity. Its appearance required uninterrupted correction. The estate could not absorb disruption without revealing the effort beneath its surface. Control here was absolute but fragile, maintained only through sustained alignment of intention and execution. This fragility was not immediately apparent. While the system functioned, it appeared seamless. The estate's isolation insulated it from external pressures, allowing authority to operate as if self-sustaining. Yet this insulation also limited resilience. Vizcaya did not evolve in response to its surroundings. It held them at a distance. Authority was preserved by exclusion rather than integration. Over time, this rigidity defined the estate as much as its grandeur. Vizcaya was not designed to transition between systems of power. It was built to remain fixed, to hold authority in place through form rather than adaptation. Its success depended on the permanence of the conditions that produced it. When those conditions shifted, the system could not recalibrate internally. What Vizcaya ultimately demonstrates is the cost of building authority from nothing. Without inherited context, legitimacy must be constantly reinforced. Architecture can impose order, but it cannot renew itself. The estate's authority was real, but it was finite, bounded by the duration of the system that sustained it. In this sense, Vizcaya stands as a complete expression of constructed power. It achieved coherence, command, and presence through deliberate design. It functioned precisely as intended. Its later transformation does not negate its purpose. It reveals it. The estate was never meant to adapt. It was meant to assert. And for a time, assertion was enough. Vizcaya functioned through coordination rather than display. What appeared seamless from the exterior depended on a dense internal structure of labor, schedules, and financial discipline. The estate operated as an organism whose visible calm was sustained by constant internal movement. Nothing within it was left adrift. Every surface, path, and room was embedded within a routine designed to prevent disorder before it could appear. At the core of this system was hierarchy. Authority within Vizcaya did not rely on improvisation. Roles were defined with precision, and responsibility flowed downward through clear lines of command. Decisions were centralized, execution distributed. Staff were organized not simply by task, but by proximity to the estate's symbolic center. Access to certain spaces implied trust. Restriction from others reinforced separation. The estate's order was social as much as architectural. Daily routines structured this hierarchy into habit. Maintenance followed cycles that aligned with climate and use. Gardens were addressed before dawn, interiors corrected between periods of visibility. Repairs occurred out of sequence with public life, ensuring that deterioration never coincided with presence. The estate did not react to damage. It anticipated it. This anticipation required constant observation and adjustment, a form of vigilance that rarely announced itself. Movement within Vizcaya reflected this discipline. Service corridors ran parallel to formal spaces, allowing labor to circulate without intersecting display. Supplies entered through routes designed to avoid notice. Waste exited with equal discretion. The estate absorbed materials and expelled byproducts without disturbing its surface narrative. Function was concealed within structure, reinforcing the illusion that the estate sustained itself. Money moved through this system with similar discretion. Expenditure was continuous, normalized as a condition of stability rather than an event. Costs were not framed as exceptional. They were embedded in routine. This normalization mattered. By treating expense as infrastructure rather than indulgence, Vizcaya reinforced the impression that its scale was natural, not excessive. Wealth here was operational, not performative. The estate's management extended beyond preservation into regulation. Temperature, humidity, and wear were monitored to maintain consistency. Furniture was rotated to distribute use. Materials were replaced according to lifespan rather than failure. These practices treated the estate as a living system subject to entropy, requiring constant correction to remain coherent. Stability was not assumed. It was engineered. Staff training reinforced this logic. Knowledge was practical and localized. Procedures were learned through repetition, not instruction manuals. The estate functioned because its routines were internalized, becoming reflex rather than directive. This internalization reduced friction, allowing the system to operate quietly. Authority did not need to assert itself repeatedly. It was embedded in expectation. Crucially, this system depended on continuity. Disruption threatened not comfort but coherence. Any break in routine risked exposing the labor beneath the surface. Vizcaya's management therefore prioritized consistency over efficiency. Redundancy was acceptable if it preserved appearance. The estate valued predictability above optimization, recognizing that its authority relied on uninterrupted form. Through this operational structure, Vizcaya achieved its defining quality, effortlessness. The absence of visible strain was not accidental. It was the product of sustained coordination across time, labor, and capital. The estate did not merely house power. It rehearsed it daily through disciplined function, yet this rehearsal required constant renewal. Vizcaya's system could not pause without consequence. Its stability was active, not passive. The estate functioned because it was always being maintained, corrected, and managed, an organism whose survival depended on the invisibility of its own work. This operational discipline shaped the estate's relationship to time in ways that were both precise and unforgiving. Vizcaya did not tolerate accumulation. Dust, wear, and irregularity were treated as threats to coherence rather than signs of use. The system was designed to erase duration, to hold the estate in a perpetual present where age registered only as texture, never as decline. This required not only labor but judgment decisions about what could be allowed to show and what had to be corrected immediately. Such judgment reinforced the estate's internal authority. Senior staff acted as interpreters of intent, translating expectation into action without constant instruction. Their role was not merely supervisory. It was custodial. They maintained standards rather than outcomes, ensuring that the estate's logic remained intact even as individual elements were replaced or adjusted. This continuity of practice allowed Vizcaya to function as a stable system despite the inevitability of material change. The invisibility of this work was essential to the estate's power. Labor that could be seen risked diminishing authority by revealing effort. Vizcaya therefore depended on spatial separation and temporal control to keep work outside the frame of display. Staff presence was calibrated, appearing only where service itself reinforced hierarchy. Elsewhere, labor was absorbed into the background, reinforcing the illusion that order was intrinsic rather than maintained. Financial flow mirrored this concealment. The estate's expenditures were structured to avoid interruption or spectacle. Payments supported continuity rather than expansion. Resources were allocated to preserve equilibrium, not to generate growth. This restraint was deliberate. By limiting visible change, Vizcaya presented itself as complete, beyond the need for improvement. The system's success lay in its refusal to evolve. This refusal, however, introduced fragility. Because Vizcaya's operation depended on uninterrupted alignment of labor, capital, and authority, it could not easily absorb external pressure. The system lacked elasticity. Its routines were optimized for repetition, not adaptation. Any shift in scale, expectation, or resource threatened to expose the labor and cost that underpinned the estate's calm surface. Yet while the system held, it functioned with remarkable precision. Vizcaya achieved what it was designed to achieve, a controlled environment where power appeared natural and unchallenged. Its operational success was measured not by innovation, but by the absence of disruption. The estate did not seek efficiency. It sought continuity. Stability was its primary output. This mode of operation defined Vizcaya as more than a residence. It was an institution sustained through daily practice. Authority was enacted through maintenance, hierarchy, and routine rather than declaration. The estate functioned because its systems aligned toward a single objective, the preservation of order without visible exertion. In this alignment, Vizcaya reached its operational peak. The estate existed as a closed circuit of control, sustained by labor that remained unseen and management that avoided spectacle. Its calm was earned daily, renewed through disciplined function. What appeared effortless was the result of constant effort, carefully withheld from view. Vizcaya reached its peak not through expansion, but through alignment. By the time the estate operated at full capacity, its systems no longer strained against one another. Money moved without friction. Labor anticipated need. Culture and authority reinforced rather than contradicted each other. The estate did not announce this condition. It manifested it through absence of noise, of urgency, of correction. Power here was quiet because it no longer needed to persuade. At this stage, Vizcaya functioned as a calibrated environment rather than a project. The architecture had settled into use. The gardens no longer asserted themselves as feats of control. They performed reliability. Routines repeated without deviation. The estate's complexity had become internalized, allowing its surface to appear simple. What had once required constant oversight now operated through habit. Hosting was central to this condition. Vizcaya did not serve as a spectacle for crowds, nor as a site of display for novelty. It received power selectively, absorbing it into its own logic. Guests moved through spaces designed to frame presence without centering it. The estate did not react to status. It contained it. Authority entered Vizcaya and found itself regulated by form, pace, and proportion. This regulation was deliberate. Rooms were scaled to encourage composure rather than assertion. Sightlines directed attention outward, toward landscape and horizon, diffusing interpersonal dominance. Sound was moderated by materials and distance. Conversation unfolded within boundaries that discouraged excess. Vizcaya hosted influence by neutralizing its volatility, converting it into stillness. Nothing within the estate was gratuitous. Even abundance was measured. Furnishings suggested continuity rather than display. Ornament reinforced hierarchy without calling attention to itself. The absence of novelty signaled confidence. Vizcaya did not need to impress because it assumed recognition. Its authority lay in its refusal to compete. Financially, this period marked equilibrium. Expenditure supported maintenance rather than growth. The estate no longer accumulated. It sustained. Money functioned as stabilizer, ensuring that systems remained aligned rather than expanded. This restraint was itself a signal. It suggested that power had reached a state where increase was unnecessary, where control depended on preservation rather than acquisition. Labor during this phase was at its most efficient and least visible. Staff routines synchronized with the estate's rhythms. Intervention occurred before disruption could register. The system appeared self-correcting, as though order were intrinsic rather than maintained. This invisibility was not accidental. It reflected a maturity of operation in which authority no longer needed to assert itself through activity. Culturally, Vizcaya occupied a position of certainty. It did not seek validation. Its references were established, its language fixed. The estate communicated stability by remaining unchanged. In a broader environment defined by movement and speculation, Vizcaya offered contrast rather than engagement. Its presence suggested that control had been achieved and did not require defense. This was the estate at its most complete. Not maximal, but resolved. Each element supported the others without excess strain. Architecture, labor, money, and culture aligned toward a single condition, sustained dominance without display. Vizcaya did not perform power. It held it. At its peak, the estate ceased to explain itself. It existed as a closed system whose authority was understood by those within it and irrelevant to those outside. This quiet coherence marked the height of its control, not because it excluded challenge, but because it rendered challenge unnecessary at this moment of alignment. Vizcaya no longer required reinforcement through gesture. Its authority was maintained through consistency. The estate's routines became self-validating, their repetition confirming the system's stability. Nothing needed to be emphasized because nothing was uncertain. Power, here, was exercised through continuity rather than assertion. The estate's spatial discipline played a decisive role in sustaining this condition. Public rooms and private quarters existed in equilibrium, neither encroaching upon the other. Circulation flowed without interruption, preventing congestion or exposure. The house absorbed presence without registering strain. This capacity to host without adaptation marked a critical threshold. Vizcaya no longer reacted to use. It absorbed it. Social interaction within the estate reflected this containment. Influence did not accumulate through confrontation or display. It circulated quietly, moderated by setting and sequence. Decisions made here carried weight, not because they were announced, but because they were framed within an environment that implied inevitability. Vizcaya lent gravity to presence by refusing to amplify it. The landscape reinforced this effect. Gardens were no longer sites of intervention, but of maintenance. Their order had become familiar enough to appear permanent. Seasonal change was acknowledged but controlled, its variation absorbed into a stable framework. Nature did not threaten authority. It was held within it. The estate demonstrated mastery not through suppression, but through predictability. Operationally, this was the moment when costs ceased to register as pressure. Expenditure had become a background condition, fully integrated into routine. Financial resources did not expand the estate. They protected its balance. The absence of visible investment signaled completion. Vizcaya systems no longer gestured toward the future. They sustained the present. This equilibrium extended to governance. Decisions were minimal, incremental, and internal. There was no need for reform or reorientation. Authority expressed itself through maintenance rather than change. The estate's leadership functioned as custodians of a completed order, preserving alignment rather than pursuing ambition. Control was exercised by refusing alteration, yet this perfection carried a quiet implication. A system that no longer evolves relies entirely on the persistence of its conditions. Vizcaya's peak was defined by stasis. Its strength lay in its closure. The estate held power by sealing itself against contingency, by assuming that what had been achieved would continue unchanged. In this state, Vizcaya stood as an accomplished institution. Its dominance was not theatrical. It did not require audience or affirmation. The estate's authority resided in its coherence, in the seamless integration of money, labor, and culture into a single unspoken order. Power had been fully translated into environment. This was the height of control, a moment when nothing pressed against the system from within, and nothing was permitted to intrude from without. Vizcaya existed in balance, complete in function and intent, sustained by alignment rather than effort. The estate did not signal its dominance. It assumed it, and in that assumption, held it quietly in place. Vizcaya did not encounter resistance in the conventional sense. There was no external force that moved against it directly, no confrontation that tested its walls or breached its routines. The pressure that began to bear upon the estate arrived without spectacle. It emerged through altered conditions, economic recalibration, shifting social expectations, and a gradual redefinition of what authority required in order to function. The first strain was financial, though it did not appear immediately as crisis. The estate had been designed for permanence under conditions of abundance. Its equilibrium depended on uninterrupted expenditure, labor, materials, correction, replacement. As broader economic patterns changed, this model became less invisible. Cost, once absorbed into routine, began to register as burden. Maintenance no longer signified control alone. It signaled obligation. This change did not diminish Vizcaya's appearance. The estate continued to operate smoothly. What shifted was the relationship between input and outcome. The resources required to sustain the system remained constant, but the symbolic return began to thin. Authority, once reinforced through the estate's existence, now required justification. Vizcaya continued to hold power internally, but its external relevance weakened. Social conditions amplified this effect. The estate had functioned within a culture that accepted hierarchy as natural and desirable. As definitions of legitimacy evolved, the logic that had sustained Vizcaya's authority lost clarity. Power no longer depended solely on form, lineage, or scale. It began to circulate through different channels, less tied to fixed environments and more responsive to mobility and abstraction. Vizcaya's solidity, once its strength became a constraint, the estate's isolation, which had previously protected its coherence, now limited its adaptability. Vizcaya was optimized for repetition, not recalibration. Its systems assumed continuity rather than negotiation. As expectations shifted, the estate did not respond. It held. This holding pattern preserved order internally, but reduced resonance externally. Authority remained intact, yet increasingly self-referential. Labor reflected this tension. The routines that sustained Vizcaya continued, but their purpose grew less apparent. Work that had once reinforced dominance now served maintenance alone. The estate still required vigilance, but the meaning of that vigilance changed. Labor preserved form rather than influence. Effort remained invisible, yet its necessity felt heavier, less justified by outcome. Culturally, Vizcaya began to exist out of alignment with its environment. The estate's language of control and permanence no longer corresponded to prevailing values. What had once read as stability now suggested inertia. Vizcaya did not fail to communicate. It communicated something increasingly out of step. Its authority persisted, but it no longer defined the terms of engagement. Importantly, this pressure did not provoke immediate adjustment. Vizcaya was not designed to yield. Its systems resisted change by default. Rather than responding, the estate absorbed pressure silently, maintaining its routines without visible compromise. This endurance preserved coherence but intensified imbalance. The cost of holding authority steadily increased even as its influence diminished. The absence of violence is what defined this phase. Nothing attacked Vizcaya directly. No force demanded surrender. Instead, the estate confronted a more difficult challenge: continued function without corresponding necessity. Its systems remained intact, yet their relevance eroded. Authority persisted within the estate, but its capacity to shape the world beyond its boundaries weakened. This was pressure without confrontation, strain without rupture. Vizcaya remained whole, operational, and controlled. Yet beneath this surface stability, the alignment that had once justified its scale began to loosen. The estate still functioned as designed, but the conditions that had given that design meaning were quietly withdrawing. As this imbalance deepened, Vizcaya's authority entered a state of diminishing return. The estate continued to demand the same discipline, the same allocation of labor and capital, yet the advantages once secured by that discipline no longer materialized. Power was still being maintained, but it was no longer being converted. The system sustained itself without producing relevance beyond its own boundaries. This condition altered how decisions were made within the estate. Choices once oriented toward reinforcement of dominance shifted toward preservation of coherence. The question was no longer how authority could be extended, but how it could be held without erosion. This subtle change mattered. It marked the point at which Vizcaya ceased to act upon its environment and began to react to it. Even if that reaction took the form of restraint rather than adaptation, the estate's fixedness became increasingly apparent. Vizcaya had been designed to resist change, to present continuity as proof of legitimacy. Under new conditions, that resistance read differently. Stability appeared less like mastery and more like refusal. The estate did not absorb emerging forms of influence. It remained anchored to a logic that no longer governed power elsewhere. Its coherence persisted, but its authority circulated inward. Financial pressure reinforced this inward turn. Resources were increasingly devoted to preventing loss rather than asserting presence. Each cycle of maintenance carried greater weight, not because failure was imminent, but because justification was thinning. The estate required constant affirmation through expenditure, yet the meaning of that affirmation was less clear. Control had become costly not in absolute terms, but in proportional value. Socially, Vizcaya's role narrowed. The estate no longer functioned as a site where power was negotiated or consolidated. It became a place where power was recalled, rehearsed, and contained. This containment insulated the estate from immediate challenge, but it also isolated it from transformation. Vizcaya remained authoritative in form while becoming peripheral in function. The system responded not by collapsing, but by tightening. Routines grew more rigid. Standards were enforced with greater precision. The estate preserved its internal order even as external alignment weakened. This rigidity sustained appearance, but it also reduced flexibility. Vizcaya could not recalibrate without undermining the very logic that had defined it. What emerged was a form of endurance stripped of expansion. The estate continued to operate flawlessly, yet its operation no longer carried consequence beyond itself. Authority had become self-referential, maintained for its own sake rather than for what it enabled. Vizcaya held together, but it no longer advanced. This was the nature of the pressure it faced. Not violence, not decay, but displacement. Power had moved elsewhere, adopting forms that did not require fixed environments or visible permanence. Vizcaya's strength, its solidity, its closure, became a limitation. The estate remained intact, but it no longer occupied the center of the system it had been built to command. By the end of this phase, nothing within Vizcaya had visibly failed. The gardens remained controlled. The interiors retained their order. Labor continued its cycles. Yet the estate's authority, once expansive, had contracted. Vizcaya persisted under pressure not because it adapted, but because it refused to change, holding its form as the world around it quietly redefined what power required. Vizcaya did not fall. It was emptied. The transition that followed pressure was administrative rather than dramatic. There was no decisive moment when authority failed or control was seized. Instead, stewardship gave way to management and management to oversight. Decisions were no longer anchored in sustaining a private system of power, but in determining what could be retained once that system no longer justified itself. The estate remained intact, yet its purpose began to thin. Ownership change was not experienced as rupture. The handover was orderly, procedural, and framed as preservation. Vizcaya passed from a closed organism into an institutional structure whose mandate was continuity without authority. This distinction mattered. What had once been maintained to project dominance was now maintained to prevent loss. The estate's survival was secured by redefining what survival meant. In this phase, extraction replaced stewardship. Not extraction in the sense of removal or damage, but in the selective retention of surface while discarding function. The labor-intensive systems that had once animated the estate were evaluated not for what they produced, but for what they cost. Elements that did not contribute directly to visible stability were reduced, simplified, or removed. Vizcaya's internal complexity was flattened. This flattening altered the estate's rhythms. Routines persisted, but they no longer reinforced hierarchy or control. Maintenance schedules replaced anticipatory correction. Systems once calibrated to prevent disorder before it emerged now responded only when deterioration became measurable. The estate remained orderly, but its order was reactive rather than directive. Authority shifted accordingly. Decisions were no longer made within the estate as expressions of will, but outside it as acts of policy. Vizcaya ceased to govern itself. It became governed. Oversight introduced accountability, documentation, and limits that had not existed under private command. These constraints preserved the structure, but they also severed it from the logic that had once sustained it. The result was a controlled reduction of purpose. Spaces designed for command became spaces for access. Rooms once restricted by hierarchy were opened and neutralized. Movement was reorganized to accommodate circulation rather than sequence. The estate absorbed visitors rather than regulating presence. This openness preserved relevance, but it also dissolved authority. Crucially, the estate was not dismantled. Its material integrity was protected. Walls remained. Gardens were stabilized. Interiors were conserved. Yet the system that had given these elements coherence was quietly withdrawn. Vizcaya became an assemblage of preserved components rather than a functioning whole. The estate survived by consenting to incompleteness. This process was deliberate. To preserve Vizcaya as it had been would have required restoring the conditions of concentrated, private authority that no longer existed. Instead, the institution chose endurance over fidelity. The estate was stabilized as an object of memory rather than a site of control. Its value shifted from what it did to what it represented. The hollowing was subtle. From a distance, little appeared to change. The estate retained its gravity, its proportion, its silence. Yet internally, the logic that had bound labor, capital, and authority into a single system was gone. What remained was form without function, order without command. Vizcaya entered a new phase not by collapsing, but by consenting to reduction. It remained whole by abandoning the role it had been built to perform. The estate continued to exist, but only by releasing the system that once animated it, preserving its surface while allowing its purpose to dissolve. As this hollowing progressed, the estate's internal coherence gave way to segmentation. Vizcaya no longer operated as a unified organism. Its components, architecture, gardens, collections, grounds were separated into categories, each managed according to distinct criteria. What had once functioned through integration was now sustained through compartmentalization. Preservation replaced orchestration. This change altered how decisions were justified. Under private authority, action flowed from intention. Under institutional management, action required rationale. Each intervention was weighed against mandate, budget, and public expectation. The estate systems no longer answered to a single logic of control, but to overlapping frameworks of responsibility. These frameworks ensured survival, but they also diluted purpose. Labor adjusted accordingly. The workforce no longer served an internal hierarchy designed to reinforce authority. Instead, it supported compliance, safety, and continuity. Expertise replaced discretion. Documentation replaced instinct. Work remained necessary, but it was no longer directional. The estate did not move toward an objective. It held position. Time within Vizcaya flattened. Without a governing will to shape its rhythm, the estate entered a continuous present. Seasonal cycles persisted, but they no longer accumulated meaning. Events did not alter trajectory. Maintenance repeated without progression. The estate existed in suspension, preserved from decay but also from development. Public access completed this transformation. Opening the estate ensured relevance, but it also finalized the removal of command. Visitors moved freely where sequence had once mattered. Interpretation replaced expectation. Authority was translated into narrative, its force diffused through explanation. Vizcaya became legible rather than directive. This legibility was not neutral. It reframed the estate as evidence rather than instrument. The architecture no longer enforced hierarchy. It illustrated it. Gardens no longer disciplined nature. They demonstrated prior discipline. The estate systems, once active, were rendered inert through display. Power was preserved as memory, not function. The physical structure endured because it no longer asked anything of the present. By relinquishing authority, Vizcaya reduced its demands on the world around it. It no longer required alignment from economic or social systems. It existed within them as a managed exception, protected precisely because it no longer competed. What was lost was not material, but relational. Vizcaya's original function depended on its ability to shape behavior, to convert resources into authority through daily operation. Once that conversion ceased, the estate's elements remained, but their interdependence dissolved. The system survived only in fragments. This was the quiet conclusion of the estate's operational life. Not a fall, but a thinning. Vizcaya persisted by allowing its core function to be removed, retaining form while surrendering force. Its survival depended on this exchange. What remained was not the institution as it had existed, but its outline intact, stable, and fundamentally altered. In this state, Vizcaya no longer asserted itself against time. It accommodated it. The estate stood not as a command center, but as a maintained presence held in place by agreement rather than power. The hollowing was complete. What endured was structure without system, permanence without authority, and a silence shaped not by collapse, but by withdrawal. Vizcaya continues to operate, but its operations now serve a different logic. The estate has not been frozen in time. It has been reorganized. What remains active are not the systems that once generated authority, but those that ensure accessibility, safety, and interpretation. The estate functions, yet its function has been reassigned. As a public institution, Vizcaya is sustained by predictability rather than command. Opening hours replace social calendars. Visitor flow replaces controlled arrival. Preservation schedules replace anticipatory correction. The estate's daily life is no longer shaped by intention from within, but by expectation from without. Its rhythms are calibrated to accommodate rather than to regulate. Certain systems remain intact because they can be translated. Maintenance continues, though its purpose has narrowed. Gardens are still shaped, but now to maintain appearance rather than to enforce mastery. Interiors are stabilized to prevent loss, not to reinforce hierarchy. The work is continuous, but its ambition is constrained. Intervention seeks equilibrium, not assertion. Other systems have been neutralized entirely. Spatial hierarchy no longer governs access. Rooms once defined by exclusion are now framed by explanation. Movement through the estate is guided, but not restricted. Authority is replaced by narrative. The architecture no longer directs behavior. It invites observation. What was once implicit must now be explained, though this translation requires mediation. Labels, tours, and interpretive structures intervene where command once sufficed. The estate's meaning is no longer assumed. It is produced through context. Vizcaya survives by becoming legible, by allowing its former logic to be described rather than enacted. Power is preserved as information, not as force. Financially, the estate operates within limits that would once have been incompatible with its purpose. Budgets are finite, allocations justified, priorities ranked. Expenditure is scrutinized for necessity rather than absorbed as condition. This scrutiny ensures survival, but it also enforces restraint. Vizcaya persists by accepting constraint as a governing principle. Labor, too, has been redefined. Staff now serve continuity rather than discretion. Expertise replaces obedience. Responsibility is distributed across roles designed to meet standards rather than uphold hierarchy. The estate's workforce sustains form, not authority. Work remains essential, but it no longer disappears into illusion. It is acknowledged as process. What cannot be translated has been lost. The closed circuit of control that once unified architecture, labor, and capital cannot operate in a public context. The estate no longer absorbs resources to produce dominance. It no longer shapes behavior through sequence and exclusion. These functions required conditions that cannot be restored. Without undoing preservation itself. Time behaves differently as well. Vizcaya no longer moves forward under a guiding will. It repeats. Seasons pass, maintenance cycles recur, exhibitions rotate. Change occurs, but without trajectory. The estate exists in an extended present, protected from decay but also from evolution. Its survival depends on remaining stable enough to be recognizable. This condition defines what remains operational. Vizcaya functions as a site of encounter rather than command, as a structure that holds memory rather than power. Its systems now serve endurance through accommodation. What continues is not the estate as it once operated, but a reassembled version designed to persist within contemporary limits. The afterlife of Vizcaya is therefore active but bounded. It works, but it does not rule. It is maintained, but it does not decide. Survival has required translation, reduction, and restraint. The estate remains present, but only by becoming something else operational in form, altered in purpose, and sustained through a logic fundamentally different from the one that built it. What endures most clearly is the estate's material discipline. Stone, proportion, and spatial coherence remain intact because they can be stabilized without reactivating authority. These elements translate cleanly into preservation logic. They can be conserved, documented, and repaired without requiring the conditions that once animated them. Material survival becomes the estate's primary form of continuity. The gardens persist in a similar manner, though with diminished agency. Their geometry is held in place through maintenance rather than command. Growth is managed, not mastered. Seasonal change is acknowledged, but its effects are contained. The gardens remain legible as designed environments, yet they no longer impose order on their surroundings. Their discipline is visual, not directive. What has been permanently neutralized is the estate's capacity to act as a system of power. Vizcaya no longer converts resources into authority. It no longer organizes labor to erase itself. It no longer regulates access to shape hierarchy. These functions cannot survive translation. They require exclusivity, continuity of command, and insulation from public accountability conditions incompatible with the estate's current role. Interpretation now mediates everything. The estate explains its former power rather than exercising it. This explanation preserves knowledge while diffusing force. Authority is rendered descriptive. The estate becomes a case study rather than a command center, its coherence analyzed rather than inhabited. What was once implicit must now be made explicit to retain meaning. This shift alters how absence is experienced. What is missing is not immediately visible, yet it defines the space. The rooms remain, but their silence is different. The gardens still align, but their stillness carries less intention. Vizcaya retains its gravity, but it no longer directs it outward. The estate's presence is intact. Its influence is not, yet something else has been preserved in the process: clarity. Freed from the need to sustain dominance, Vizcaya's original logic becomes legible. The estate can now be read as an artifact of a specific ambition rather than as an ongoing claim. Its systems, once closed, are open to analysis. Survival has allowed comprehension. This comprehension does not restore function. It replaces it. Vizcaya's afterlife depends on distance from its original purpose. By accepting reinterpretation, the estate avoids obsolescence. It remains relevant by becoming illustrative rather than operative. The cost of this relevance is finality. The system that once governed the estate cannot be reassembled without negating the conditions of its survival. What remains operational, then, is a careful balance. The estate continues to demand resources, attention, and care. It continues to structure experience through form and space, but it does so without asserting authority. Its operations sustain memory, not power. Vizcaya endures as a maintained presence shaped by absence. Its survival is not a continuation of what it was, but a transformation into something more constrained and more transparent. The estate persists by allowing its original function to remain in the past, holding its form steady while its force dissipates quietly within it. Vizcaya remains because it was allowed to stop insisting. That fact alone places it within a distinct American pattern, one in which permanence is pursued aggressively, achieved briefly, and then maintained only through retreat. The estate does not survive as a ruling structure, but as a negotiated presence. Its endurance has required the removal of power from its core. Within American elite history, this is not unusual. Wealth in the United States has often attempted to substitute duration for inheritance, to compress legitimacy into form rather than lineage. Vizcaya belongs to this impulse. It represents a moment when authority was believed to be constructible through scale, discipline, and aesthetic certainty. What followed reveals the limits of that belief. American permanence has rarely depended on continuity of control. It has relied instead on preservation, on the ability to stabilize surfaces after influence has moved elsewhere. Vizcaya reflects this logic with particular clarity. The estate has been protected not because it still governs, but because it no longer does. Its survival is conditional on harmlessness. This condition reframes permanence itself. What remains at Vizcaya is not authority extended through time, but form detached from function. The estate stands as a complete object precisely because it no longer competes with the present. Its presence does not interfere with contemporary power structures. It does not demand alignment. It asks only for care. That care carries its own cost. Preservation requires constant investment without return. Resources are committed not to produce influence, but to prevent erasure. This is a different economic logic from the one that built Vizcaya. The estate once justified its expense through authority. Now it justifies it through memory. Permanence has shifted from assertion to obligation. This shift raises a quiet question, embedded in the estate's continued existence. If permanence depends on the suspension of power, what exactly is being preserved? Vizcaya retains its material integrity, its coherence, its visual command. Yet the system that once gave those qualities consequence has been removed. What survives is an image of control without the capacity to exercise it. American elite culture has long oscillated between ambition and containment. Vizcaya occupies the point at which ambition concedes to containment in order to remain visible. It is not unique in this respect. Similar estates, institutions, and symbols endure in parallel states maintained, admired, and disconnected from the authority they once concentrated. Permanence is achieved not by holding power, but by relinquishing it safely. This relinquishment is not framed as loss. It is managed, rationalized, and institutionalized. Preservation presents itself as continuity, even as it marks an endpoint. Vizcaya is not allowed to disappear, but neither is it allowed to act. Its endurance is secured by limiting its relevance. Within this framework, decline does not announce itself. It settles. The estate's silence is not emptiness, but resolution. What was once contested has been agreed upon. Vizcaya's place in history is no longer negotiated. It is curated. The cost of this certainty is finality. The question that emerges is not whether Vizcaya has survived, but what kind of survival this represents. Is permanence meaningful when stripped of authority, or is it merely the last stable form a system assumes before becoming purely symbolic? Vizcaya offers no answer. It stands intact, maintained, and quiet, embodying a version of American permanence that endures only by accepting its own withdrawal from power. Vizcaya's endurance therefore exposes a structural paradox within American elite history. The nation's wealth has repeatedly sought to fix itself in place, to convert mobility into settlement and accumulation into legacy. Yet the conditions that allow such fixation rarely persist. Power in the American context remains restless, responsive to markets, innovation, and abstraction. When it moves on, what it leaves behind must choose between decay and preservation. Vizcaya chose preservation. But preservation exacts a price. It requires the suspension of intent. The estate can no longer act without destabilizing the justification for its care. Its survival depends on restraint, on the refusal to reactivate the logic that once defined it. Authority, once essential, becomes incompatible with endurance. Permanence is achieved by narrowing function until only form remains. This narrowing alters how the estate is understood. Vizcaya no longer participates in the production of elite power. It documents it. Its spaces hold the residue of decision-making without hosting decisions themselves. The estate becomes illustrative rather than operative, valuable for what it reveals rather than what it enables. Its presence clarifies a moment rather than extending it. In this role, Vizcaya assumes a distinctly American character. It does not anchor a lineage. It does not command allegiance. It stands as evidence of an attempt successful for a time to manufacture stability in a culture defined by motion. The estate shows how far wealth can go in substituting structure for history, and where that substitution ultimately stops. What is preserved, then, is not permanence in the traditional sense, but a controlled memory of ambition. Vizcaya holds its shape because it no longer insists on consequence. Its gardens align, its rooms remain composed, its surfaces endure, but they do so without expectation. The estate no longer seeks to influence the future. It accepts its position as a resolved past. This acceptance allows the estate to remain visible while avoiding contest. Vizcaya does not provoke resistance because it no longer asserts relevance. It is protected precisely because it does not compete. In this way, preservation becomes the final accommodation between power and time, a settlement in which authority withdraws so that form may persist, whether this constitutes success or closure is left unresolved. Vizcaya does not argue for itself. It does not instruct the viewer on how to interpret its survival. It simply remains intact and limited, a structure that outlived the system that required it. Its continued existence suggests that in the American tradition, permanence is possible, but only once power has learned to let go. The estate stands as a quiet ledger of that exchange. What was gained in visibility was lost in agency. What was saved in stone was surrendered in function. Vizcaya endures not as a living institution, but as a carefully maintained boundary between ambition and memory, marking the point at which American permanence becomes something that can be preserved only after it has ceased to rule.